Welcome to our video series on the prevention of hate speech and disinformation.
Hello, my name is Professor Catherine Gelber and I'm the head of the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. I'll be talking about links, connections and conflicts between freedom of speech and the regulation of hate speech. I'll start with the power of public speech, and then I'll talk about the harms that hate speech can have on communities, and finally I'll talk about laws that exist to stop the spread of hate speech. So when freedom of speech was first developed as a codified human right, the primary issue at stake was protection from overburdensome government intervention. This is still true, but today we also tend to think of speech in more complicated ways, and in particular we tend to think of speech as a kind of action. Speech is not simply an externalisation of one's thoughts. Instead, many people now think of speech in terms of what it can do in the world. Speech can judge, it can marry, it can comfort, and it can harm. A person's ability to do what they want to do with their words differs according to the speaker who is speaking and the context in which they speak. A speaker engaging in speech that wants to do something, like stereotype or discriminate against someone, needs to have the authority to do that in the context within which the speech occurs. Sometimes that authority is granted formally, for example when it's a politician or a police officer or a community leader. But sometimes the authority is granted informally, either because people around them just give it to them. For example, think of the person who makes a racist joke at a family meal and no one intervenes or says anything. Or sometimes society, the society in which we live, grants authority to people making these kinds of speech acts. In a society within which racism is systemic, for example, racist hate speech is granted authority by the existence of that systemic racism. For hate speech to happen, as well as the speaker having relevant authority, a target needs to be vulnerable to that harm. So in any society there are groups that are vulnerable to systemic discrimination, and hate speech can be defined as systemically discriminatory speech. It is speech that actively discriminates against people who already face systemic discrimination in the context within which the hate speech occurs. This means that to be vulnerable to hate speech, you need to be vulnerable to systemic discrimination in the context in which the speech occurs. How does hate speech harm? Well, the arguments say that it can harm in two ways. The first is that it can harm in a causal way. That is, it causes those who are exposed to hate speech to undertake separate and discrete acts of harm against those who are vulnerable. This could be in the form of violence carried out against minorities, but also other things like intimidating them and a loss of associative liberty. Secondly, hate speech can enact constitutive harms. This means that the hate speech can harm its targets just in the saying of it. It does this, in Langton's words, by ranking them as inferior, legitimating discriminatory behaviour against them and silencing them, either literally because they're too scared to speak, or in the sense that they can speak but their words don't achieve what they want them to achieve. Many of the laws around the world that target hate speech are criminal laws, and as such they target the top of the hate speech pyramid. This means that to be actioned, hate speech needs to be of the most harmful and virulent kind. Criminal laws aimed specifically against hate speech exist in Canada, Germany and France, for example. In Southeast Asia, only Australia has specific criminal laws to curb hate speech, although in practice it's the civil laws that are most often used. In the Philippines and Myanmar, proposed anti-hate speech bills were not passed into law. In countries like Australia and Canada, there are also civil provisions to combat hate speech. These types of laws allow policymakers to take action against examples of hate speech that are not of the most virulent kind. They allow them to target the equally important middle part of the hate speech pyramid. On the one hand, they can be seen to infringe less on freedom of speech because people cannot be directly jailed due to their conduct, unlike in criminal cases. On the other hand, they can be seen to infringe more on freedom of speech because they allow action to be taken against less virulent hate speech. Many countries, of course, also do other things, like engage in educational efforts to combat the problem. It's also possible to prohibit hate speech with provisions that have nothing to do with hate speech on the surface, but they still capture the types of conduct that might constitute hate speech. For example, the Philippines Cybercrimes Act of 2021 and their Safe Spaces Act of 2018 prohibit intimidation of a group based on gender or sexuality. In Indonesia, the Electronic Information and Transactions Law was amended in 2016 to allow the termination of access due to immoral content, hate speech, insult, or defamation. The problem with tackling hate speech in this way is that hate speech can be thrown in with other types of speech without acknowledging the gravity of the impacts hate speech can have on vulnerable communities. So, hate speech laws are needed that target hate speech specifically. International law relies on persuasion as its principal mechanism of enforcement. This law includes Article 4 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as well as Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. International law places significant obligations on signatory states to combat hate speech. There's a constant debate on where to draw the line between what should be protected, what should be regulated, and how we should carry out efforts to combat hate speech. Some organisations, such as Article 19, suggest that counter-speech is the best way to stop hate speech. This view is controversial, in my opinion, because it puts the responsibility on those being affected by hate speech to engage in the counter-speech campaigns. This is an unfair burden, especially when their capacity to engage in counter-speech has been materially impaired by being subjected to hate speech in the first place. If counter-speech efforts are to work, then governments and communities need to support targeted communities and their allies to help them engage in countering the hate speech that they're experiencing.